I'm Louise, and I'm 52 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in this little coffee shop overlooking the rugged coastline of Maine, watching my phone buzz incessantly on the wooden table. 3 days ago, I received a text message that shattered everything I thought I knew about motherhood and love. It was from my son Marcus, and it said simply, "You're not invited." Those 3 words, sent just days before his wedding, ended a relationship I'd spent 34 years building. I'd worked 3 jobs to put him through Harvard, sacrificed everything so he could have the life I never had. And now, as I watch the waves crash against these ancient rocks, I realize that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. Before I tell you this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real stories from life's most challenging moments. Now let me share with you exactly how I disappeared and watched my son's perfect wedding day crumble from afar. The story really begins 34 years ago when I was 18 and pregnant. Marcus's father took one look at that positive pregnancy test and vanished faster than morning fog. I remember standing in that tiny bathroom holding the test with shaking hands, knowing my life had just changed forever. But I made a choice that day, a choice that would define the next 3 decades of my existence. I would give this child everything I never had. Being a single mother wasn't the romantic struggle you see in movies. It was brutal, relentless, and exhausting in ways that aged me beyond my years. I worked as a hotel housekeeper during the day, cleaning up after wealthy guests who dropped more money on room service than I made in a week. My hands became permanently rough from industrial cleaning chemicals, and my back ached constantly from changing countless sheets and scrubbing endless bathroom tiles. Evenings found me waitressing at a local diner, serving coffee and pie to truckers and night shift workers. The smell of grease clung to my hair, and my feet swelled in cheap shoes that I couldn't afford to replace. But every dollar went toward Marcus. Every single penny was invested in his future. Weekends were for freelance bookkeeping hunched over kitchen tables, with calculator and ledger books helping small businesses balance their accounts. While other young women my age were dating and discovering themselves, I was discovering the price of unconditional love. But watching Marcus grow, seeing his bright eyes light up when I brought home new books or educational toys, made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Marcus was brilliant from the start. While other children struggled with basic reading, he was devouring chapter books. I spent money I didn't have on tutoring, on enrichment programs, on anything that would nurture his incredible mind. I remember the night he got his SAT scores, how he hugged me so tight and whispered, "Mom, I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to make all of this worth it." Harvard accepted him with a full scholarship. The day we got that acceptance letter, I cried for 3 hours straight. All those years of exhaustion, all those nights falling asleep over accounting books, all those moments of wondering if I was enough suddenly made sense. I had raised a son who would have opportunities I could never have imagined. When Marcus graduated law school, he pulled me aside at the celebration dinner and said something I'll never forget. "Mom, I'll never forget what you did for me. Every sacrifice, every extra shift you worked every time you went without, so I could have what I needed. I promise I'll spend my life making you proud." I believed him completely. For years he kept that promise. He called regularly, visited often, and always made sure I knew how much he appreciated everything. He'd send flowers on holidays, take me to nice restaurants, and introduce me proudly to his colleagues. I finally felt like all those years of struggle had created not just a successful man, but a good man who understood the value of sacrifice and love. Then 6 months ago, everything began to change when Marcus introduced me to Sophia. She was stunning, poised, and came from the kind of family that summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. Her father owned a real estate empire, and her mother, Patricia, had clearly never worked a day in her life, but somehow managed to look down on everyone who had. The first time I met Sophia, I noticed how her eyes swept over my department store dress and discount shoes with barely concealed disdain. When Marcus proudly told her about my multiple jobs and how I'd put him through school, Sophia's smile was polite but cold. "How interesting," she said in a tone that made it clear she found it anything but interesting. At their engagement party held at Sophia's family's country club, I felt like an anthropological exhibit. Patricia asked about my current career with the kind of fake interest that wealthy women use when they're really asking why someone like me was in their space. When I explained that I now worked part-time at a local library and did bookkeeping on the side, the silence that followed was deafening. The changes in Marcus started slowly, so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Our weekly phone calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When I'd visit his expensive downtown apartment, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone or finding reasons to cut our visits short. The first real warning sign came during a dinner party at Sophia's parents' house. I'd dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd splurged on at Macy's, and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. But from the moment I walked in, I felt like I was wearing a neon sign that said, "Doesn't belong." The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to: private schools I'd never heard of, vacation destinations. I'd never seen restaurants that cost more for one meal than I spent on groceries in a month. When Patricia served wine and began discussing proper pairing techniques, I politely declined, saying I didn't drink much. The look she exchanged with Sophia spoke volumes. "Oh, that's right," Patricia said with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I suppose wine appreciation is something of an acquired taste. It requires a certain exposure." The way she said exposure made it clear she wasn't just talking about wine. When someone mentioned the importance of proper dress codes at formal events, Sophia glanced meaningfully at my dress and added, "Some people just aren't familiar with certain social expectations. It's understandable." Marcus said nothing. He just sat there cutting his steak with careful precision, as if he hadn't heard his fiancée essentially call his mother inappropriately dressed. That night on the drive home, I waited for Marcus to acknowledge what had happened. Instead, he said, "Mom, maybe next time you could dress up a little more. Sophia's family is used to a certain level of formality." Those words hit me like a physical blow. This was my son, the boy I'd raised to stand up for what was right, asking me to change who I was, to make his future in-laws comfortable with my existence. A week later, Sophia suggested we go shopping together for my wedding outfit. "I want to help you find something perfect," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. We spent 3 hours in department stores, while Sophia steered me toward the clearance racks and made subtle comments about what might be more suitable for your budget or age-appropriate. When I found a beautiful dress that actually fit well and made me feel confident, Sophia frowned and said, "It's lovely, but perhaps something a little less attention-grabbing. We want to make sure you're comfortable and not overshadowing anyone." The message was clear: know your place and stay in it. I tried harder after that, determined to bridge whatever gap existed between Marcus's old life and his new one. I checked out etiquette books from the library, practiced proper place-setting arrangements, and even took a wine tasting class at the community college. But every effort seemed to widen the chasm rather than close it. Marcus's calls became even less frequent, and when he did call, it wasn't to ask about my life or share his own. Instead, he'd lecture me about wedding protocols and appropriate behavior, as if I were a child who needed instruction on how to exist in polite society. The worst part was watching the son I'd raised disappear behind a mask of social climbing and status consciousness. This wasn't the Marcus who used to defend kids being bullied at school, who'd been outraged by injustice and inequality. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, speaking in careful phrases designed to maintain his position in a world that had never wanted people like us. The wedding planning process became a masterclass in exclusion disguised as inclusion. Every decision was made around me, never with me. When I offered to help with arrangements, having planned many successful events for the businesses I'd worked with over the years, Patricia smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, that's so generous, but we have professional planners handling everything. We wouldn't want to burden you with such complicated details." The rehearsal dinner meeting was when things escalated from subtle to obvious. I arrived at the country club where the pre-wedding festivities would be held, hoping to finally feel like part of the celebration. Instead, I found myself seated in what was clearly the problem-solving chair, while Patricia outlined her concerns. "Louise," she began, her voice dripping with false concern, "I hope you understand that this is going to be a very exclusive event. Many important people will be attending, business associates, family, friends who've known us for generations. The atmosphere needs to be just right." She paused, studying my reaction carefully before continuing. "I'm sure you want what's best for Marcus's future, and first impressions in his professional circle are so important. Perhaps you might consider keeping a low profile during the festivities. Nothing dramatic, of course, just mindful of the overall tone we're trying to achieve." I sat there processing what was essentially being asked to make myself invisible at my own son's wedding when Marcus walked in. Surely, I thought, surely he would put an end to this. But when Patricia repeated her suggestions, with Marcus present, he simply nodded thoughtfully and said, "Mom, she has a point. This wedding is really important for my career. Some of the senior partners from my firm will be there." The financial humiliation came next. When Sophia mentioned the wedding hotel arrangements, she suggested that I might be more comfortable staying at the Holiday Inn down the road rather than the luxury resort where the wedding would take place. "It's much more reasonably priced," she said, "and honestly, you'd probably feel more at ease somewhere less formal." Marcus not only agreed, but offered to make the reservation for me as if he was doing me a favor. The same man who used to brag to his friends about his mother's strength and resilience now seemed embarrassed by my very existence. But the ultimate betrayal came during a family dinner when Marcus introduced me to some of his law firm colleagues who'd stopped by Sophia's parents' house. "Everyone, this is Louise, a family friend who's been very supportive over the years." A family friend. 34 years of sacrifice, love, and devotion had been reduced to family friend status, because acknowledging me as his mother might reflect poorly on his new social position. I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the gold-framed mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller, somehow diminished by the constant erosion of her worth. When had I become someone who needed to be managed and minimized? When had the love of my life become ashamed of the woman who'd given him everything? The final straw came during what Marcus called a heart-to-heart conversation. He'd asked me to meet him for lunch, and I'd hoped it meant he'd finally recognized what was happening and wanted to make it right. Instead, he spent an hour explaining why I needed to understand the situation. "Mom, this wedding isn't just about Sophia and me. It's about my future, my career, the life we're trying to build together. Some of the people attending have the power to make or break my partnership track at the firm. I need everything to go perfectly." When I tried to explain how his behavior was hurting me, how I felt erased from his life, he interrupted with impatience. "Mom, what you did for me growing up, that was your choice. I never asked you to sacrifice everything. And now I need you to understand that sometimes what's best for the family means making difficult decisions. Your choice." Those two words echoed in my head long after he'd paid the check and rushed back to his office. Everything I'd done, every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, had been reduced to my choice, as if love and sacrifice were selfish acts that deserved no consideration or respect. The text message arrived on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:17 a.m. I remember the precise time because I was staring at my phone in complete disbelief, certain that what I was reading couldn't possibly be real. "Mom, after much consideration, Sophia and I think it's best if you don't attend the wedding. You're not invited. This is what's best for everyone involved." I read those words over and over, waiting for them to change, or for a follow-up message explaining that it was some kind of mistake. But my phone remained silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The wedding was in 3 days. 3 days, and my only child had just uninvited me from what should have been one of the most important moments of both our lives. I tried calling immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting back, asking if we could talk, asking him to explain, asking him to reconsider. Nothing. An hour later, another message appeared. "I'll explain later. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Don't make this harder. As if I was the one being unreasonable. as if 34 years of unconditional love and support had earned me the right to make things hard when I was being erased from my son's life. I sat in my kitchen surrounded by photo albums filled with Marcus's childhood memories. Pictures of birthday parties I'd saved for months to afford graduation ceremonies where I'd cheered the loudest holidays, where it was just the two of us against the world. In every single photo, Marcus was smiling at me with pure love and trust. The child who'd once said I was his hero had become a man who couldn't bear to have me witness his happiness. The initial shock gave way to a grief so profound it felt physical. I cried until my chest ached and my eyes swelled shut. I cried for the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I cried for the teenager who'd defended me when other kids made jokes about single mothers. I cried for the young man who'd promised to never forget my sacrifices. But then, as I sat surrounded by the debris of my broken heart, something shifted. The crying stopped, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead or make excuses or try to convince anyone of my worth. If Marcus wanted to exclude me from his life, then he could experience what life without me actually looked like. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the small suitcase I'd used for the occasional weekend trips I'd allowed myself over the years. For the first time in months, I wasn't planning my actions around Marcus's needs or Sophia's opinions or Patricia's disapproval. I was going to disappear, and they could handle whatever consequences followed. I packed carefully but quickly comfortable clothes, a few books, my journal, and the small emergency fund I'd been saving for years. I didn't pack the expensive dress I'd bought for the wedding or the carefully chosen accessories. Those belonged to a version of myself that no longer existed. I left a brief note for my neighbor, asking her to collect my mail and water my plants. I didn't explain where I was going or when I'd be back, because I honestly didn't know. All I knew was that I needed to be somewhere far away from the wreckage of my relationship with Marcus. The 6-hour drive to coastal Maine passed in a blur of highways and half-formed thoughts. I'd chosen Maine because I'd always found peace near the ocean, and because it was far enough from home that I wouldn't accidentally run into anyone I knew. I needed complete anonymity to process what had just happened to my life. I checked into a small bed and breakfast overlooking Penobscot Bay. The owner, a woman named Eleanor, who looked to be about my age, showed me to a simple room with white walls, hardwood floors, and a window that framed the ocean like a living painting. "You look like you could use some peace," she said kindly, and I realized it was probably written all over my face. That night I sat by the window watching fishing boats return to harbor, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of the constant low-level anxiety that had become my normal state. For the first time since Marcus had entered Sophia's world, I wasn't worrying about what I should say, or how I should dress, or whether I was embarrassing anyone by existing. Saturday morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of weather that turns the ocean into a silvery mirror stretching toward infinity. It was Marcus's wedding day, and instead of waking up in a hotel room getting ready to watch my son get married, I was hundreds of miles away drinking coffee and watching seagulls dive for fish. I deliberately turned off my phone the night before, wanting to experience this day without the intrusion of whatever drama might be unfolding back home. This was Marcus's choice, and I was going to honor it completely. If he wanted to get married without his mother present, then he would get exactly that experience. I spent the morning walking along the rocky coastline, breathing in salt air, and feeling the wind tangle my hair. There were no judgmental glances here, no whispered comments about my appropriateness or value. I was just a woman taking a walk no more or less worthy than anyone else sharing the morning with the sea. For lunch, I found a small lobster shack where locals gathered to share gossip and complain about tourist season. I ordered clam chowder and a lobster roll, food I'd never been able to afford during Marcus's childhood, but could now enjoy without guilt. The elderly man at the next table struck up a conversation about the weather treating me like any other human being worth talking to. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Marcus's perfect wedding was beginning to show cracks. The wedding planner, a high-strung woman named Clarissa, who'd been hired specifically because she managed events for society families, was having what could only be described as a controlled panic attack. She'd been trying to reach the mother of the groom since Thursday for final confirmations about flower arrangements, seating charts, and the reception timeline. Every call went straight to voicemail, and the text messages remained unanswered. Clarissa had handled hundreds of weddings, but she'd never had a key family member simply vanish 2 days before the event. Marcus. She cornered him during the morning rehearsal. I really need to speak with your mother about the family photo schedule and the receiving line arrangements. She's not answering my calls, and there are several decisions that require her input. Marcus's face went pale. He'd somehow convinced himself that uninviting me would simplify things, that my absence would be a minor detail easily managed. It hadn't occurred to him that wedding logistics actually required the participation of both sets of parents, or that my sudden disappearance would create ripple effects throughout the entire event. She's dealing with a family emergency, he lied smoothly, but Clarissa's experienced eye caught the hesitation. Will she be arriving later today? Because if we need to adjust the timeline— No, Marcus said firmly. She won't be attending. Please remove her from all arrangements. The word spread quickly through the family and friend networks. Marcus's Aunt Diana, my sister-in-law, who'd been like a grandmother to Marcus, cornered him immediately after the rehearsal. What do you mean Louise isn't coming? She's been planning for this wedding for months. Where is she? Marcus mumbled something about a mutual decision and complicated circumstances. But Diana wasn't buying it. She'd watched me sacrifice everything for Marcus, and she knew I'd never voluntarily miss his wedding unless something catastrophic had occurred. Marcus James, she said, using his full name the way she had when he was a misbehaving child. You tell me right now what's really going on. But Marcus couldn't tell her the truth. How could he explain to his family that he'd uninvited his own mother because his new in-laws found her embarrassing? How could he admit that he'd chosen social advancement over the woman who'd given him everything? The ceremony proceeded, but even Patricia noticed the whispered conversations and confused glances from guests who kept looking toward the front row where I should have been sitting. Several of Marcus's law firm colleagues approached him before the processional asking when they'd get to meet the famous mother who'd put him through Harvard. She couldn't make it, became his standard response, delivered with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. As I finished my peaceful lunch in Maine, Marcus was discovering that erasing me from his wedding didn't eliminate questions about my absence. If anything, it created more attention and speculation than my presence ever would have. Throughout the ceremony, he found himself distracted scanning the crowd and noticing how many people seemed confused by the incomplete family dynamics. The wedding photos would forever show an awkward gap in the family arrangements, a missing piece that made every smile seem forced and every celebration feel hollow. That evening, as I watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I finally turned my phone back on. The screen immediately exploded with notifications, 47 missed calls, 23 voicemails, and a stream of text messages that told the story of growing desperation. I didn't listen to the voicemails immediately. Instead, I sat on the bed and breakfast's wraparound porch rocking gently in a wooden chair and read through the text messages in chronological order. They painted a picture of a day that had gone from celebration to crisis in the span of a few hours. The week following Marcus's wedding became a masterclass in consequences. What he'd intended as a simple elimination of an embarrassing element from his special day had instead created a complex web of problems he wasn't equipped to handle. The first crisis emerged when the wedding vendors began submitting their final bills. Marcus discovered that I'd been quietly coordinating with several of them for months, not just as an involved mother, but as someone who'd volunteered to handle logistics I had experience with from my bookkeeping work. The florist had been expecting my final approval on centerpiece modifications. The photographer had arranged for special family portrait sessions based on our conversations. The caterer had been working with me on dietary accommodations for elderly relatives. Without my input, details fell through cracks no one had noticed existed. The flowers arrived in the wrong configuration. The photographer missed capturing several important family groupings. The special meals I'd arranged for relatives with dietary restrictions never materialized, leaving Marcus's diabetic uncle unable to eat most of the reception dinner. But the logistical problems were nothing compared to the social fallout. Wedding guests who'd expected to meet the legendary mother who'd single-handedly raised Harvard's newest star lawyer started asking increasingly pointed questions. Marcus's Aunt Diana had taken it upon herself to call several family members, trying to piece together why I'd suddenly vanished. By Wednesday, the truth began to emerge. Diana had cornered Sophia's cousin, who'd had too much wine at the reception, and let slip about the inappropriate mother situation that had been handled before the wedding. Within 24 hours, the extended family knew exactly what had happened, and they were not pleased. The phone calls started immediately. Marcus found himself fielding increasingly angry conversations with relatives who'd watched him grow up and couldn't believe what he'd become. His uncle Robert, a man who rarely raised his voice, left a voicemail that Marcus would replay obsessively. "Boy, I don't know what kind of man you think you've become, but it's not one your mother should be proud of. Louise worked herself to the bone for you, and this is how you repay her. You should be ashamed." At work, things weren't going better. The senior partners at Marcus's law firm had indeed attended the wedding, and several had specifically requested to meet the mother they'd heard so much about during Marcus's interview process. When she was conspicuously absent, and Marcus's explanations became increasingly vague and uncomfortable, it raised questions about his character that hadn't existed before. Partner Thomas Williamson pulled Marcus into his office Friday morning. "Son, I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've learned that how a man treats the people who can't do anything for him tells you everything you need to know about his character. Your colleagues are asking questions about your family situation, and frankly, so am I." Marcus tried to explain about complicated family dynamics and difficult personalities, but experienced lawyers know evasion when they hear it. The conversation ended with Williamson's quiet observation, "Whatever's going on with your mother, I'd suggest you fix it. We promote lawyers here, not people who abandon the folks who got them where they are." But perhaps the most devastating consequence was what was happening in Marcus's marriage. Sophia had initially been pleased with how smoothly the mother problem had been handled. But as the criticism mounted and the social embarrassment grew, she began to see Marcus differently. Her own friends started asking pointed questions about why the groom's mother hadn't attended the wedding. When the truth inevitably emerged, Sophia found herself defending a decision that made her new husband look heartless and ungrateful. The sophisticated social circle she'd wanted Marcus to join began viewing him not as an impressive addition, but as someone who'd betrayed the most basic principles of family loyalty. "People are talking," Sophia told him during an increasingly tense conversation. "They're saying you're the kind of man who abandons his family when it becomes convenient. That's not the kind of reputation I want to be associated with." Patricia, who had orchestrated much of my exclusion, suddenly found herself fielding uncomfortable questions from her own social circle. Nothing made wealthy women more nervous than a man who could so easily discard someone who'd sacrificed everything for him. If he could do it to his mother, what would he do to a wife who displeased him? 2 weeks after the wedding, Marcus was facing a level of social and professional isolation he'd never experienced. The law firm colleagues who'd once respected him were now distant and formal. Family members who'd once celebrated his successes were now openly critical of his character. Even Sophia's friends were beginning to suggest that perhaps she'd married someone who wasn't quite what they'd expected. The breaking point came when Sophia delivered an ultimatum. "Marcus, you need to fix this situation with your mother. I don't care what it takes, but this drama is affecting both our reputations. People are starting to question what kind of family we are, and I won't have that." For the first time since sending that devastating text message, Marcus was forced to confront what he'd actually done. He'd traded his relationship with the most important person in his life for social acceptance that was now crumbling because of that very betrayal. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so completely devastating. He tried calling me repeatedly, but my phone remained off. He drove to my house multiple times, finding only my neighbor, who politely explained that she was collecting my mail but had no idea when I'd return or where I'd gone. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus couldn't fix a problem with money connections or charm. He could only wait and hope that the damage he'd done wasn't beyond repair. Meanwhile, I continued my healing retreat in Maine, completely unaware of the chaos I'd left behind. I'd found peace in routine morning walks, afternoon reading, evening journaling. I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades, interests and dreams that had been set aside in service of Marcus's needs and ambitions. 3 weeks into my Maine retreat, I developed a routine that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced in years. I woke each morning without an alarm clock, my body finally free from the constant low-level stress that had characterized my life since Marcus entered Sophia's world. I'd make coffee in the small kitchenette of my room and carry it to the window seat where I could watch the harbor come alive with fishing boats and early morning joggers. This particular morning, however, my routine was interrupted by the persistent ringing of my phone. I'd been keeping it on silent, checking messages only once a day, but something about the insistence of the calls made me look. Marcus's name filled the screen, and for the first time since I'd left, I felt ready to hear what he had to say. His voice was raw when I answered, stripped of the confident professional tone he'd adopted since joining the law firm. "Mom," he said, and I could hear tears threatening. "Please don't hang up. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you." I stayed silent, not out of anger, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say. The Marcus on the phone sounded like the child I'd raised, vulnerable and desperate, but I'd learned not to trust my instincts about who he really was. "Mom, I've destroyed everything," he continued. "The wedding was a disaster without you there. Everyone kept asking where you were, and I had to keep lying. And after, God, Mom, I didn't realize how much people respected you, how much they'd judge me for what I did." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to find words. "Sophia's family is questioning what kind of man I am. My colleagues at the firm are treating me differently. Uncle Robert hasn't spoken to me since he found out what really happened. And Sophia—" his voice broke completely. "Sophia says she's not sure she knows who she married." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had excluded me to preserve his social standing, only to discover that his social standing depended largely on the respect people had for the relationship we'd shared. By betraying me, he'd revealed something about his character that made him unsuitable for the very circles he'd been trying to join. "Marcus," I said finally, my voice steady and calm, "I raised you better than this." Those simple words carried the weight of 34 years of love, sacrifice, and disappointment. I hadn't screamed or cursed or demanded explanations. I'd simply acknowledged the truth we both knew somewhere along the way. The values I'd instilled in him had been abandoned in favor of social climbing and status seeking. "I know," he whispered. "Mom, I know. I don't have any excuse for what I did. I got caught up in Sophia's world and what her family expected in trying to be someone I'm not. I convinced myself that keeping you away from the wedding was protecting you from their judgment, but really, I was just protecting myself from being embarrassed by my own background." This was the first honest thing he'd said to me in months, and it hurt more than all the lies and excuses had. My son had been ashamed of me, ashamed of the life we'd built together, ashamed of the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. "The worst part," he continued, "is that I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself that you wouldn't be comfortable in that environment, that it was better for everyone if you weren't there. But really, I just didn't want to deal with Sophia's family looking down on us, looking down on me for coming from the background I come from." I walked to the window while he talked, watching boats bobbing in the harbor. Each one was different in size, age, and purpose, but they all belonged on the same water. The harbor didn't judge which boats deserved to be there based on their polish or pedigree. They simply coexisted, each serving its own purpose. "Marcus," I said, "what you did rippled through more than just our relationship. It affected how people see you, how they trust you, how they understand your character. When you exclude someone who loved you unconditionally, you tell the world something about who you are that you can't take back." "I know that now," he said. I've lost the respect of my family, my colleagues are questioning my judgment, and my marriage is falling apart before it even really started. But Mom, none of that matters compared to losing you. You're the only person who ever loved me, without conditions, without expectations, without needing me to be anything other than your son. The conversation continued for over an hour. Marcus told me about the wedding day disasters, the family confrontations, the professional consequences, and the growing problems in his marriage. But more importantly, he told me about the moment he realized what he'd lost. I was sitting in my apartment last night looking at a photo from my law school graduation. You were so proud, Mom. You were practically glowing with happiness. And I realized that in all the wedding photos, in all the pictures from this supposedly perfect day, I don't look happy at all. I look like I'm performing, like I'm pretending to be someone else. The only time I've ever looked genuinely happy in photos is when I was with you. By the end of our conversation, I'd made a decision. I would return home, but not to resume the relationship we'd had before. That relationship had been built on my willingness to sacrifice my own dignity and self-worth for Marcus's comfort and success. The new relationship, if there was to be one, would be built on mutual respect and equal standing. Marcus, I told him before hanging up, I'll come home next week, but I want you to understand that things can never go back to the way they were. I won't ever again allow myself to be treated as an embarrassment or a problem to be managed. If you want me in your life, it has to be as an equal, as someone whose presence adds value rather than someone whose absence is preferable. Yes, he said immediately. Whatever it takes, Mom. Whatever you need. What I need, I said, is for you to figure out who you really want to be. Not who Sophia wants you to be, not who her family expects you to be, but who you want to be. Because the man who uninvited his mother from his wedding isn't someone I recognize, and he's not someone I can have a relationship with. I returned home on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The trees were showing their autumn colors, and my small garden had been carefully maintained by my neighbor. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like returning to a childhood bedroom that had been preserved but no longer quite fit. Marcus was waiting on my front porch when I pulled into the driveway. He looked older somehow, as if the past month had aged him beyond its actual duration. When he stood up, I could see uncertainty in his posture, the careful way he approached me, as if I might disappear again at any moment. "Mom," he said simply, and I could see that he'd been crying. We went inside and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework as a child, where we'd planned his college applications, where we'd celebrated his law school acceptance. But this conversation was different from any we'd ever had. For the first time, we were talking as two adults, rather than as a mother managing her son's needs. Marcus told me about the weeks since I'd left. His marriage to Sophia was effectively over, though the divorce proceedings hadn't officially begun. She'd realized that her new husband's character flaws extended far beyond family relationships, and the social embarrassment of being associated with someone who'd abandoned his mother had become too much for her image-conscious family to bear. His position at the law firm was secure, but his prospects for partnership had been significantly damaged. The senior partners had made it clear that someone who could betray family loyalty so casually might not be trustworthy in client relationships or business partnerships. Most importantly, Marcus had spent the month examining who he'd become and how he'd gotten there. He'd started seeing a therapist not to fix our relationship, but to understand how he'd developed values so contrary to everything I'd taught him. "I got seduced by a world that I thought I wanted to belong to," he admitted. Sophia's family represented everything I'd never had growing up: money, status, connections, ease. I convinced myself that if I could just become someone they respected, I'd finally be successful in a way that mattered. But in trying to become worthy of their respect, I replied, you became someone who wasn't worthy of your own respect. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I treated you like you were something to be ashamed of, instead of someone to be proud of. I let them convince me that your strength and sacrifice were somehow less valuable than their inherited privileges. I became exactly the kind of person I used to despise. The conversation continued for hours. We talked about forgiveness, but also about boundaries. I made it clear that while I was willing to rebuild our relationship, I would never again allow myself to be diminished or hidden to accommodate someone else's comfort. I had spent a month rediscovering my own worth, and I wasn't willing to surrender it again. Marcus, I told him, I love you unconditionally, but unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional disrespect. If you want me in your life, you need to understand that I'm not just your mother anymore. I'm Louise, a complete person, with my own value, my own dignity, and my own boundaries. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt our relationship on entirely new terms. Marcus filed for divorce from Sophia, a decision that was as much about his own integrity as it was about our relationship. He'd realized that staying married to someone who'd encouraged him to abandon his family would be a betrayal of everything he wanted to become. I started dating for the first time since Marcus was born, something that surprised both of us. I joined a book club, took art classes, and traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, but had never prioritized during my years of single parenthood. I was becoming the complete person I'd never had the chance to be when my entire identity was wrapped up in being Marcus's mother. Marcus began volunteering with organizations that helped single mothers pursue education and career development. He said it was his way of honoring what I'd done for him while also helping other women who were making the sacrifices I'd made. A year after the wedding that had destroyed our relationship, Marcus and I took a trip together to Maine. We stayed at the same bed and breakfast, where I'd spent my healing month, and we walked the same coastal paths, where I'd rediscovered my own worth. Mom, he said, as we watched the sunset over Penobscot Bay, I need to thank you for disappearing that day. I looked at him with surprise. Thank me. If you'd stayed and begged or pleaded or tried to convince me I was wrong, I might have let you back in without ever really understanding what I'd done. By walking away, you forced me to experience the consequences of my choices. You made me realize what life without you actually looked like, and it was empty and hollow, and nothing like the sophisticated existence I thought I wanted. We sat in comfortable silence watching fishing boats return to harbor. The same boats I'd watched a year earlier, while processing the worst betrayal of my life, were still going about their daily routines, unchanged by the human drama that had played out around them. I learned something important during those weeks when you were gone, Marcus continued. I learned that all the success in the world means nothing if you achieve it by betraying the people who helped you get there. I thought I wanted to be accepted by Sophia's family, but what I really wanted was to feel worthy of the sacrifices you'd made for me. And the only way to be worthy of those sacrifices was to honor them, not hide from them. As I listened to my son speak, I realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be treated badly. By walking away when I was excluded and rejected, I'd given Marcus the opportunity to choose who he wanted to be. If I'd stayed and accepted the mistreatment, I would have enabled his worst instincts and prevented his growth into the man he was capable of becoming. The relationship we built after my return was stronger than what we'd had before, because it was based on mutual respect, rather than obligation and guilt. Marcus no longer saw me as someone who'd sacrificed for him and therefore deserved his pity or management. Instead, he saw me as someone who'd made choices out of love and deserved his respect and admiration. You know what I realized, Mom, he said as we prepared to leave Maine. I spent so much time trying to become someone worthy of respect from people who didn't matter. I almost lost the respect of the only person whose opinion truly counted. I squeezed his hand and smiled. You didn't lose it, Marcus. You just had to fight to get it back. And that fight made both of us stronger. Sometimes the people we love most take the most advantage of our love, not because they're cruel, but because they know we'll tolerate from them what we'd never accept from anyone else. Setting boundaries isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about refusing to enable behavior that diminishes both people in the relationship. I learned that walking away isn't giving up on someone you love. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do, because it gives them the chance to miss you, to appreciate what they had, and to choose to become someone worthy of having you back in their life. And if they don't make that choice, then you've learned something important about who they really are and what they actually value. The greatest gift I gave my son wasn't 34 years of sacrifice and support. It was the 4 weeks when I disappeared completely and let him experience life without me. That's when he learned the difference between the life he thought he wanted and the life that would actually make him happy. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to save the relationship? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real stories about family love and the courage to set boundaries. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let the people you love face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes walking away is the only way to find your way back to each other.